What is going on, everybody? It is your boy, the Big Signorelli, and you are watching the Parallax Viewer. Today, we are continuing our project, our investigation into Seminar 16 of Jacques Lacan, entitled From Another to the Other. All right. And if you've been enjoying the series, that is great. And this is a learning project which will develop into a project which will be, maybe a large paper or just something in the process, article, log, again, paper, who knows? This can be something that can be contributed in an anthology. Who knows what will happen from this? I think I just had a huge spark to do my own work in 16 after participating in Daniel Tutt's emancipation group on Seminar 16, which was back in the beginning of 2024. And just all the work that I've been doing with the later Lacan, uh, in juxtaposition with the earlier Lacan and seeing a lot of similarities. And then also reading Jean-Claude Milner's work on Lacan, science and philosophy, which I will in the future do a project on that because I do believe that that is an important work to understand a lot of Lacan's theories regarding the signifier, the subject of science, etc. And so we left off to get into today's topic. We left off from facts and what is said, and now we will be dealing with the fifth lesson of the second section of Seminar 16 called "I Am What I Is." Right, and before I really get into that, I just want to you know beat a dead horse and just to really emphasize this notion of the signifier, right? And this notion of the signifier, again, is not to be conflated with the original Saussurian sign, right? And so, with the Saussurian sign, we're dealing with a primordial relationship, a minimalist theory of science based upon a couple of axioms, but also just because its object is minimal, because we're only dealing with language, um, with just the sign that is the signifier and the signified. And there's a lot of meaning placed within the signified, and that the signifier refers directly towards the concept of the thing. So again, cat and then the image of cat, right? But for Lacan, he flips this on its head to really put the emphasis on the signifier, which does not depend upon the referent, nor does it depend upon the thing, nor is it really reducible to the empirical phenomenon of a child that is acquiring language and grammar that is pointing at things, and that is the signifier and signified relationship. And also that it can't be reduced down to, and not just the signifier, but even language for Lacan cannot be reduced down to the sort of psychical somatic phenomenon. This theory of language, if we could call it that in Lacan, refers to the subject and the subject of science in which psychoanalysis situates itself, referring to the essay on science and truth. But in the agency of the letter, or the instance of the letter in the Acree, he even says that like the signifier, as I just said, does not refer directly to the signified. And if you kept up with the Vanishing Meteor project, he talks about this in Seminar 3. And it's not also a nominalism, right? So it's not reducible to a psychologism, is referring to the subject, but the subject is not a psychologism. It is not consciousness, right? It is the Cartesian subject, to which to refer to Michael Downs in our recent talk on AI and psychoanalysis, etc. When we started to get into language and the signifier, and even the subject of science, which is the Cartesian cogito, that it's meditation too, where we really see the subject that Lacan will take up with the fact that it's negating everything. I'm not that. I'm not this, right? The subject doesn't have any positive qualities. It is qualityless. It doesn't have any empirical features to it. It is a pure formalism. I think even Karatani says this in his outline of Descartes and all the different criticisms put onto Descartes to really show like Descartes was like with the subject is like the first formalist or the first structuralist, if you could apply that term to him. But this is what the signifier for Lacan represents. It's a reference point. Language in structural linguistics is the sort of reference point to understand scientific breaks and to account for psychoanalysis within the scientific break. And this reference point is not language in itself, but that language refers to the thing which survives the break, which is the subject. And we are now dealing with a modern subject because of modern science. And that modern subject was inaugurated from the Cartesian subject. The Cartesian subject, which is the subjectivity of both philosophy and of science. And so, last point when it comes to language is that language exists before the being. Why? Because we are thrown into a society where language exists. And so to say that language exists before the living individual, right, is not to create a metaphysical idealism of language, right? It's honestly quite as dumb and simple as just saying that like we already exist in a social, we already exist in the world, right? It's the fact that we live in a social bond of a bunch of speaking beings, so therefore language permeates the entire socius. And so when the baby is thrown into the world, right, they are thrown in also into everyday language, everyday discourse, right? So this is where we could see the formulation of the signifier and the subject latch onto itself like a parasite onto this morsel of a child, right? And so I'm going to share my screen. Actually, we'll do the whiteboard first. And yes, this is me. And let's see if I have, yeah, we do have it. All right, all right. So, these are drawings, right? What I was trying to talk about is pretty much this right here. Big S looks like a 5. Little s. This is the formula for the signifier in its basic algorithmic form. It is an algorithm privileging this bad boy right here, this signifier, right? Which has nothing to do with the referent, because the reality is that the signifier is what represents the subject, right? It represents the subject. So I'll draw another one right here. So this is the signifier, and this is the signifier in another formula which represents the subject. This is exactly what I've been talking about since day one of this seminar, right? And throughout all the other seminars prior to this, we get something like this. We get signifier, split subject, and then I think it's like another signifier. This does not mean S1. This is just like another stroke, is like another signifier. And then we have little s, right, as signification, right? And what Lacan is trying to do, that was a messed up S, is to show really how we get the subject, what represents this, who is represented by a signifier. And what the signifier is doing is not only getting its own meaning from another signifier, because that's the key thing, is that signifiers do not represent themselves. They represent the subject. And they don't refer to themselves for their meaning. They refer to other signifiers for their meaning. But the signifier has a annihilating effect embedded into it. So the opposite of day is not night. The opposite of day is non-day. And a contrary or a difference is allowed to enter in because of that annihilating effect, meaning we have a differential network. But and later we also realize that we have difference as well, and that's because of something called letter, right? I will go over that maybe in another time, but I just want you to remember these things. This is kind of a review of stuff that I've been talking about in prior seminars. And on this in this formula, right, we see that this represents another signifier, and then we could just write, if we want, on this bar, just boom, another stroke. So this represents it, and then it goes so on and so on and so on, right? It just keeps going, right? Other signifiers. And right here at the bottom, we get the effect of signification, right? Because this formula, again, has to do with this metaphorical effect that the signifier can take on from metonymy. Things like familial nair have that function as well. He talks about this in seminars 5 and I believe 6. I mean, he talks about it in other seminars too, and he'll go back to it in 14. But what we're really aiming at with this thing right here, this little algorithm, is that a signifier represents the subject to another signifier, right? And we'll call this other signifier the chain of signifiers that are being represented by this guy, this little signifier, right? And this is the locus of the big other, the locus of the chains of signifiers. This is where we get the Russell's paradox, because we have a choice of representing the subject, but this signifier is only a representative. It doesn't have any meaning. It needs its meaning from this. But this thing, we realize, doesn't have a signifier to complete it, to plug it in. So we have a constituted, totalized field of knowledge. God, for Descartes, who guarantees the field of truth, who guarantees certainty, and makes sure that and make sure for Descartes that he is not deceived, right? So Lacan will say this, right? And then we'll write it like that. This means that this is the heart of, if we really have to sum up and reduce down what seminar 16 is about, it's about navigating through this formula right here. That there is no signifier for the big other, that there is no big toe that will complete every single theory, that there is no universe of discourse. Now, this isn't a pessimism, but this is something that psychoanalysis arrives at. This is the heart of neurosis. This is the heart of the unconscious. And so what the subject does is repress this moment. This is the scene of primal repression. And this is the inauguration of not only castration, but the unary trait, right? And this problem of the one, and this problem of surplus jouissance that comes out from that, this little a, right? This little remainder, right? Of something like the one of language plus this little a, which could also be written like this, a minus, because a is a subtraction, it is a whole, it is excess, it is entropy, it is waste. And he could not have done this without not only privileging the signifier over the signified, but also making a homology between linguistics, or the sign, and mathematics. Because what I just demonstrated right here, as you've seen in my last presentation on the topology of the other, is the Russell's paradox, the Russell set, right? And this is how we are to understand the formation of the unconscious via the signifier, because the signifier is what represents the subject, the split subject, which is subject of the unconscious. And like the signifier mathematics in mathematical logic, which uses more letters than it does numbers, refer to a chain of different symbols or formalisms. These are also universes of discourse. We call them universes of mathematics, and there is no mathematics that will contain all mathematics in the Russell set. There is no catalog for the final to contain all catalogs, right? And there is no signifier that will contain all signifiers. There is no final discourse. There is no meta language, right? And to put it in the simple terms, there is nothing that will complete the other and also satisfy my enjoyment, my jouissance. There's always a leftover. There's always a remainder. There's always a subject that is outside of that field that cannot be fully represented, right? So that's what I just wanted to show for now. We're going to close this out. I will stop sharing, but then I will share again because I want to get back to the text. We'll get back to the text themselves. All right. So let us begin. When alone, I sometimes jot down little notes for you. When assembling my papers today, I came across one that will serve me as an introduction here. It is so unfortunate, I wrote. I no longer recall when that God serves the excluder, owing to the what I will call the prescribing of his name. This took on the form of prohibition precisely when people best knew the function of the term God, namely among Jews. You know that for them, there is an unpronounceable name. Well, this prescription serves precisely to exclude a certain number of references that are absolutely essential to maintaining the I in the adequate light, enough light that it cannot be thrown to the dogs, in other words, to the professors. Last time you heard me, if not saw me, refer almost in spite of myself to I by means of the God in question. Indeed, I translate what was one day proffered in the form of Ea aser Ea, as I am what I is, and I justify it, or believe me, justified in this translation. I told you that I myself was a bit overwhelmed with this enunciation slip out. And when I said that Mount Sinai had emerged in spite of myself from the ground between my legs, I was expecting to receive a little note from someone pointing out that these words came out of the burning bush, but I didn't. Can you imagine the effect it would have had if I said that the burning bush had emerged from between my legs? We can clearly see here that a sentence gives itself orders retroactively. It is because I wanted to end the sentence with between my legs that I put Mount Sinai in the place of burning bush. It is, after all, the consequences of the thing that we see on Mount Sinai. He who announces himself as I am what I is. At least that is the way I put it. Merely enunciated the law of I am speaking in the form that, since that time has been transmitted in the imperative of the list of the 10 Commandments, said to be from God. I already mentioned this in my seminar on ethics, which is seminar 7. It is true, as I put it, that truth says I. It seems quite self-evident that thou shalt love the one who said, I am what I is, and thou shalt love only him. By the same token, thou shalt love, as it puts, thy neighbor as thyself. Thyself here is nothing other than that to which it is said, that to which the commandment themselves are addressed as to thou, and even to a thou art, whose truly magical ambiguity in French I have been pointed out for a long time. You are or thou art is pronounced exactly like tuer, the verb to kill, and tues, the imperative kill. So you see seminar 3, which I think he's referring to some of the inversions that we see in like neurosis, and then like some of the ways that there is no inverted language in inverted message in psychosis, but also like the delusions that come up about like, I don't love him, it's he who hates me, etc., or he wants to kill me. Um, the prelude underlying these commandments is thou art, that instates you as I. In an invocation, we find that the same penchant opportunity is offered to this tu twant, lethal thou. And we know that there is but a short step from an order to respond to it. All of Hegel's work is designed to show what it is built upon. We could take up the commandments one by one, the one about lying and the prohibition of coveting thy neighbor's wife, his ox or donkey, which is always the one that kills you. It is hard to see what else we could covet, because that's precisely where desire is located. We should note that owing to a self-evident connection, there can be no speech, strictly speaking, except where the wall, the fence, the clôture around such a commandment preserves. This explains why, since the beginning of time, no one obeys these commandments very carefully. And it is also why speech, in the sense in which truth says I, remains profoundly hidden and emerges only by showing the tip of its nose from time to time in the interstices in discourse. Inasmuch as there is a technique that places its trust in this discourse in order to refine something therein, a path, or as people say, and that assumes it is not totally unrelated to truth and life, as people put it. But we must be aware of the flip side of discourse. It would perhaps make sense to question more closely what in this discourse can legitimately constitute a bridge towards the foundational and inaccessible term that the last of the philosophers, Hegel, rather audaciously believe he could eliminate with his dialectic. And I'll read this last paragraph right here and then stop. Along the trail that I have begun to blaze, the quote, I initially appears before the other, as allowing a logical gap to be discerned as the locus of an original flaw born in speech, insofar as speech can respond. So I think like what he's getting at here is you know, this thing about the God of Abraham, right? The God of Moses and the Hebrews themselves. Well, one, you're not supposed to say, you know, the Lord's name, and at the same time, this sort of statement at the burning bush of I am what I is conjures up, something similar to the tautology, which seems to be indicative of the Hegelian A equals A, which A apparently is not equal A, that there is a difference. But the key thing about this is the fact that this kind of relates to what is happening at the level of the unconscious, the truth that speaks. I speak and I think, right? In Descartes, it is I think, which is the level of the enunciation, right? Which is different from the chain of knowledge that articulates itself along the apodosis of therefore I am, therefore I am existing, therefore I am being, therefore I am a subject that has a body, or whatever you want to put. I think, I speak, or in the liar's paradox, I am lying, right? The truth for Lacan fundamentally speaks that Freudian thing, the unconscious, which is of course the discourse of the other, as he's been saying since function and field of speech and language and psychoanalysis, right? That the unconscious is fundamentally situating itself around the discourse of the other. And this is what the subject is doing with the signifier. It is trying to situate itself within the other, within the locus of speech, within the locus of signifiers, right? It is trying to address something within the other, and the other form of the unconscious articulation, or sorry, the form of the unconscious enunciation just literally says, I am, right? When Moses encounters the burning bush, it sees the Lord himself, asks, what are you? The enunciation is, I am. what I is, right? What I is seems to be fundamentally different if I'm not if I'm getting it right. The I is different from the I am. The what I is seems to be the level of the enunciated, right? And possibly this distinction between the I of the subject and the grammatical subject, the grammatical I of the sentence. Again, split subject of enunciation and enunciated. But that this is what happens at the level of the unconscious. We have a half-spoken truth, right? That says something only to radically deny or negate the suffering. And so I think Lacan is trying to play on the God of the Hebrews to something fundamental in the unconscious that orients itself like this. And last thing I'll say when he mentions this thing about language and commandments without art, and the way that there is this sort of commandment that nobody follows, right? And the whole thing about coveting something of the other, something that we are doing to take it away from the biblical frame of reference and put it into more analytical reference, is that we are always trying to covet something because of desire. Desire wants what the other has or what the other enjoys, that there is a knowledge to the other's enjoyment that is desirable, or that there is something about their desire that brings forth a knowledge about enjoyment that I want to covet, that I want to have, right? That's why I situate myself, at least on the level of the unconscious, the signifier, right? That aims at the cause, or that it represents the subject, and the subject aims at the cause of its own discourse, this discourse that is constantly circulating around this failed opportunity of inquiring what does the other want, right? What am I for the other? Or what does the other desire that I don't have, or that I must learn? Okay. So let's get back to the text. The I appears first as subjugated, a sujet. It's a neologism of the subjugated subject. We're not only subjected or subjects, but we're subjugated, right? Maybe we're subjugated to the signifier or even the non-subject. I wrote this word somewhere to designate the subject insofar as he is overly ever produced in discourse and divided. Seminar 5. If the animal who speaks can only at first embrace his partner qua subjugated, it is because he has always already been speaking. And in the very broaching of the embrace, he can formulate thou art by killing himself in it. The others, the partner, he makes himself into the locus of the signifier. Allow me to return for a moment to the I, which is mentioned. And lastly, the time since I received the objection from someone, from someone with a pretty good head on his shoulders, that by translated in this way, I opened the new a door anew, as it were, to a reference to this being. That is being, in accordance with the tradition's terminology, depended upon being. It was thus heard by at least one ear, as appeared to being. It is the case that I am thereby enunciating the supreme being that the tradition erects in order to answer for all the beings subsisting in nature in the earliest sense of the term, in some natural order, question mark. Does my I is designate that being around which everything changes and revolves, and which thus occupied a pivotal place in the universe, the place of the X, thanks to which there is a universe? Absolutely not. Nothing can be further from what I intended with my proposed translation. I am enunciating in the quote I of the quote I is what truly gives the ground of truth, or backdrop or content of truth. Solely insofar as it speaks. In order to convey this, I could amend the translation as I am what the I is. Here, the is can be read more clearly. The commandment that undergird truth are, as I sufficiently indicated earlier, truly antiphysical. There is no way to speak of the truth, to speak what we call by that name, without referring to them. Try it yourself. You can't manage to do so in the slightest. The commandment constitutes an ideal point. That is truly the word for it. No one ever knows what that means. Similarly, as soon as one begins discoursing with what arises are laws of logic, namely a subtle coherence linked in the nature of what is known as a signifying articulation. This is what makes it such that a discourse either holds up or it doesn't, owing to the structure of what is known as the sign, which is related to what is commonly known as the letter, as opposed to the spirit. What initially dominates discourse are those laws of articulation. And so to bring it back further, just to say shortly so we could keep reading, that, this goes back to the combinatory factor that, logic comes out of language. It's not that we have logic first and then language, because goes back to this whole point as far back as from the beginning of the seminar, and of course all throughout Lacan, but in this seminar, that logic itself conforms to language and not the other way around, right? And of course, when we speak or when we write, there is a grammatical logic that exists. He says, colorless green ideas sleep furiously. That statement doesn't make any sense at all. And yet it conforms to a logic of grammar insofar as that there is just language, right? And so what he's getting at is that, the logic arises out of the combinatory factor, which is the signifying chain, right? Or the combination of letters to create language, right? And the signifying articulation, which comes from the negation and the differentiation that I said about in the beginning, right? So then that we could have laws that sprout from discourses, right? And so we don't have the fact that the subject aims at the cause of its own discourse, right? Or that structure is the realist, without first having language. And so to even say that there is no such thing as a meta, or there is no meta language, right, is not a meta linguistic statement, because it still relies upon language and the logic that is born from within that language. To put it bluntly, we only know that I before E except after C exists as a grammatical logical rule in the English language, or at least in American English, insofar as we combined letters, anglicized phonetic letters, to then be able to speak and write. And so then we have that law or that rule from that signifying and logical articulation. In my class here this year, I have begun to enunciate the other's field without incarnating it in any way, in order to test whether it can be conceptualized as the field of inscription of the articulated discourse. It is on the basis of its structure that this is the second stage, the possibility of thou can be defined, which is going to reach us an appeal to something that will have to call itself the I at the third stage. What will appear, and what we are expecting and what we know fully well, is that in every truth, the I is unpronounceable. That is why everyone knows to what degree it is troublesome, and that the preferable, as the laws of speech itself remind us, to never say, I swear. So let us not presume anything about the other. Let us leave it an open question. Even if it is nothing but a blank page, it will already give us more than enough trouble, as I demonstrated on the board last time. Let us assume that you have written the totality of signifiers on a blank piece of paper. Again, we were talking about at the beginning. This is conceived since you can choose the level at which the signifier is reduced to phonemes, right? On the condition that this piece of paper be a page, in other words, finite, it can be demonstrated that if you assemble on the page anything about which you could claim that is the subject, in quotes, the term necessitated by this assemblage will have to be situated outside of the totality. S2, the other signifier that comes into the picture when I enunciate that the signifier is what represents the subject for another signifier will be off the blank page. S2 will not be found on that page. What I will say in what follows about anything that is enunciated will have to begin from this phenomenon, which can be demonstrated to be internal to every specific enunciation. And this is why we should dwell on it a bit longer. Let us take the simple enunciation. It is raining. It can be fully appreciated if we dwell on what emerges from the fact that it is said that there is some pluie, which I don't know what that, I think that just means rain. This is the event brought about by discourse, a discursive event, right? By which the very person who says it posits himself as secondary. The event consists in something being said, undit, right? Who placed it, whose place is marked by the it or it. But the grammatical subject is so difficult to clearly discern that we must proceed carefully, right? Because he's saying it is raining. There is something like a grammatical subject there, but it is hard to discern because he's not saying I am raining, because that would not make sense. Or maybe we could say like, you know, in a metaphorical sense, I'm sweating so much I'm practically raining. Now we have, the enunciation, then we also have the grammatical subject as well. But that's a different thing. It is quite different to say it is raining, right? To where we have to decipher where the grammatical subject is at in this process of stating something, right? And where the S2 would even be, right? The grammatical subject, uh, the grammatical subject uh has to be investigated further, right? It has to be um it has to be pretty much dive what's the term? It has to be divested through or discerned through this process of language in the way of speech and articulation and enunciation. Sorry, I was losing my words for a second. I got a bit distracted from external factors, but what I'm trying to say is that, the grammatical subject, to bring it quite simply to the analytics scenario, hides itself in certain statements, right? Um, like I was using this example, like when an analysan is like, the world is shitty, people are poor these days. Well, actually, you know, you could say that uh in the subject and the predicate, it's like maybe the subject, versus the predicate is like the world, right? So if there's two different sentences, the world would be the subject, and shitty would be the predicate, and then people again is the subject, and the predicate is would be the latter, like the world is shitty, people are poor these days, or people are broke these days, whatever they're saying. But in the analytic situation, really, the difference between the grammatical subject is also the difference between the subject of enunciation, which is really the fact that he's saying, my world is shitty, I am broke, or I am poor these days, right? That's what the heart of the matter is, not trying to understand what the subject and the predicate of the statement is, but at the level of the enunciation, what is being said and masked over by the statement that is being articulated in the signifying function, right? So let's get back to the heart of the text right now. And so he says, this is so let's read this again. This is at the event that's brought about by discourse, a discursive event by which the very person who says it posits himself as secondary. So it is raining. The event consists in something being said, whose place is marked by the it, right? But the grammatical subject is so difficult to clearly discern that we must proceed carefully. It could take on different morphologies in different languages, and it is not necessarily isolated. It is related to what I earlier called the orchamp, outside of the field, off of the page, more or less individualized. As I just reminded you, that that can also be reduced to a suffix. For example, the little t at the end can be found traipsing all about in French.
why does it show itself up in the place where it has no business being, where it is not part of the conjugation, as for example, in orntil. Yeah, I don't speak French, so forgive my pronunciation. Does it adorn or does it decorate? Question mark. The grammatical subject is thus merely the place where something comes to be represented. Let us return to S1 insofar as it represents something, and to S2. Last time we had to extract S2 from the other's field since it couldn't be included there. The S2, the assemblages S alpha and S beta, the and S gamma, again, we're dealing with set theory, in which we claim to grasp the subject insofar as these S's satisfy a certain function, R, right? The Russell set defined in the other's field by X is not an element of X, right? X is an element of R also equals that R is a set of X insofar as X is not an element of itself, right? So, right, Rx transforms all these elements, which happens to be signifiers here, into something that remains indeterminate since it is open, something that takes on the function of the variable X. Once we specify that the variable must correspond to a proposition, which is not just any old proposition, it is not the variable must be good or red or blue, but that it must be a subject, that the necessity of the signifier S2 as other arises because it cannot in any way be inscribed in the other's field. It is in its earliest form, this signifier clearly defines the so-called function of knowledge, S2, right? And then he has this right here, S alpha, S beta, and S gamma as the A. And this is trying to correspond to S2, which really has to deal with this statement, thou, right? So this little thing is addressing thou. And what is thou really but this articulation of knowledge that is trying to occupy itself within the other, within these three sets that are supposed to be contained by the other, right? But we realize that that is also impossible because the other doesn't have a signifier to contain itself. I will come back to this, for this place has perhaps not yet been adequately emphasized in what has thus far been said about the logical function, namely that the fact that qualifying the subject as such situates us outside the other. Numet is perhaps the form of noumenon, numen, that will lead us further than we think. Uh, when we consider the difficulties that are generated by the logical reduction of classical statements, by which I mean Aristotelian statements evolved around the universal and the particular, to the field of quantifiers, we should raise the question whether it wouldn't in fact be easier to realize that all and some must be placed outside of the other's field. Rather than say all men are good or all men are bad, it doesn't matter which wouldn't the proper formulation be to set it doesn't matter which, wouldn't the proper formulation be to state that, quote, men or whatever else, um, whatever you can adorn with a letter in logic, are all good or are some good? In short, if we situated the universal and the particular as syntactic functions outside of the field, outside of the other's field, doesn't it seem that we would have uh, less trouble reducing them to mathematics. For indeed, the field of mathematics desperately is operating in such a way. Yeah, because there is a sort of syntactic logic to set theory, from what I understand. There is a sort of grammar, syntactic function, I should say. There is a sort of grammatical logic within set theory. For indeed, the field of mathematics involves desperately operate in such a way that the other's field coheres, which is the best way to show that it doesn't, that it is not consistent to the use of the technical term, and testing it by making all levels link up, for it is at many different levels that it does not cohere. It is in so far as the other's field is not consistent that enunciation takes on the form of demand, right? And it does so even before anything whatsoever that can carnally respond to it shows up there. Let's read that again. It is in so far as the other's field is not consistent, right? That enunciation takes on the form of demand, as we were saying. the demand operates in that form of the other because the other is consistent or is not consistent. It's inconsistent. Not only is there a hole in the other that ultimately that gap that cannot be completed, but at first it shows up as inconsistency. And the inconsistency is where the demand on the part of the baby, which will soon be a split subject, articulates itself as. If we go so far as possible in questioning the other's field, we can perceive its gaps. All right. So now we're talking about the gaps or that hole, right? In the as far as possible in questioning the other's field, we can perceive its gaps at a series of different levels. To test this, mathematics provides us an exemplary field of experience, where it can allow itself to limit the other's field to well-defined functions like arithmetic. What research in arithmetic, in fact, shows is not germane to us for the time being. You have heard enough about it to know that in the field selected among the simplest, we're greatly inspired or surprised. That was funny. That was a funny slip. Inspired and surprised. When we discover that completeness, for example, is missing, namely that one cannot say that whatever is stated in that field must be either proved or disproved. Moreover, in one of the simplest fields, it can be called into question whether certain statements in it are provable. Yeah, another level appears at which it is provable that a statement is not provable in that field. It becomes quite odd and strange in certain cases when the unprovable itself eludes us, and that it cannot even be asserted that it is not provable. And in a distinct dimension appears, which is known as the undecidable. These scales, not of uncertainty, but of flaws in logical texture, can allow us to grasp the status of the subject as such. So he's trying to show, so it seems to me that he's like trying to get at something that is like sort of unique to understanding mathematical logic when it comes up to impasses of, you know, what is provable and unprovable, or to even be able to make clear distinctions of what is itself provable and unprovable, and also this notion of undecidable, this undecidability, which that I will have to admit I'm not as familiar with. I think that does exist in certain mathematical, in a certain mathematical context, undecidability, or maybe I'm just spitting out of my ass, but this sort of thing, which to take away from logic, let's just say that the subject with the signifier is pretty much in this position of not only provable and unprovability, right? And usually in the Cartesian sense, right? God is what allows the provable and unprovable, right? God allows for the field of knowledge or the field of truth to have certainty and to keep them from being deceived by an evil demon or an evil God, right? No matter how much I have doubt and skepticism, there is a universe that allows me to have an element of doubt, right? But that universe is governed by God, right? But in this sense, this undecidability, I think, takes on a different dimension, quite unique, that Lacan seems to be interested in with regards to the neurotic subject. Let's just say the neurotic subject. These scales, not of certainty, but of flaws in logical texture, can allow us to grasp the status of the subject as such, to find a prop for him, and to go still further, to consider that he can be satisfied by adhering to the gap that is situated at the level of enunciation. Broaching the other's field from the outside of logic, nothing has ever stopped us, it seems, from creating a signifier which with which to connote what is lacking in signifying articulation itself. We are willing to summarize the other's field, as I have already done. And if my sizable audience here is willing to indulge me, I can perhaps convey and render necessary in a discursive statement, or even demonstrate in some logical construction, the following: that the signifier with which a subject is satisfied, in the end, identifying with it, cannot be situated as identical to the very flaw in discourse, assuming you will allow me this condensed formulation. Here again, I am articulating this as an aside. Can those of you here who are analysts fail to realize that it is owing to the lack of exploration of this kind that the notion of the castration that you sensed in passing, I hope to be analogous to what I am saying, remains vague and uncertain and is handled with the clumsiness and brutality that we see all around us? Is really taking shots at modern analysis. Well, not our modern analysis, but the analyst that was modern to him, that was contemporary to him. In practice, it is in fact not handled at all. People substitute for it quite simply what the other cannot give. They talk about frustration where something else is clearly at work. They occasionally broach it on the path of deprivation, but as you will see, deprivation is a part and parcel of a flaw inherent to the subject that we must broach, right? So, I mean, he's also criticizing the object relations because, like, the point of like analysis and even I think psychology as well is like frustrating the patient is what kind of allows you to uh work analytically, and they're focused on the patient, right? But he's like, no, like of course, like there is a frustrating element, and there's also a deprivation to the subject. That's inherent in that. But there's something that happens in castration that has to do with the mark of the other, right? It's castration, and because it's so used clumsily, that we can't even investigate, you know, its problems and what entails castration and how that affects the logic that the subject embarks themselves with, insofar as this logic pertains to a discourse, right? Um, but before moving on today from what I am merely tracing out the lines of, without ever being able to foresee what I will manage to get you to bear by the end of the year, I will give a brief indication. To those of you who have some knowledge of certain theorems that are enunciated in the field of logic, S2 clearly serves in its function when, from the outside of a certain arithmetical system, a well-defined capital A, it counts everything that can be turned into theorems with the system. Otherwise stated, a genius by the name of Gödel realized that it counts must be taken literally. If we give what is known as Gödel's number to each of the theorems that can be situated in a certain field, something can be broached that had never before been formulated concerning the functions I was able to merely mention earlier: completeness and decidability. It is clear that everything is henceforth different from the former times in which one could state that in the end mathematics is solely tautological, and that human discourse can thus remain what it is. In the past, mathematics was supposed to be the field of tautology. Everything changes once it is most surely refuted that there is a capital A somewhere that remains identical to itself. This result constitutes a true step forward. To those of you who are confronted in the psychoanalytic practice with what seems to be transcendent aporia with respect to what is known as natural history, but who still do not see any reason to rely on logic to correctly situate what presents itself in the psychoanalytic field, it being the field of an entirely different kind of enunciation, the kind that allows for us for and also directs the Fortean practice. I would point out that it is, first of all, insofar as the other is not consistent, that enunciation assumes the form of demand. And so he gives us the formula for demand right here. That's also on the graph of desire. This is what provides the import of what is written as barred S with the lozenge and a capital D, which represents demand, right? This is a subject who is caught within demand because there is an inconsistency of the other. And so he shows right here the graph of desire, right? At the level of the refusal, right? And I think what is being refused is the encounter of barred S, or sorry, S with barred A, right? The fact that there is no signifier to complete the other, right? There's no signifier for the other. That puts itself on the emphasis of demand. I am asking myself, right? Which is really inverted into I am asking you. Now, right here at the bottom, we have the subject of enunciation and the voice of the other that speaks, right? So right here, you have this area at the bottom where the subject of enunciation is actually, I think, what he's getting at is something that is tautological. What you want and what I want, right, are sort of blurred right here. But because there is a sort of embedded inconsistency, and this is the problem of the shifter of the eye is located right here in this juncture, which tries to relate to itself, because you have desire, and then you have the I. I think what is being refused is what I said earlier. Like, of course, I've heard refusal as in like the refusal to speak in this session, but also the refusal to admit the other's barred inconsistency or inconsistency and barredness, right? That we end up at this place of demand. Um, I am asking myself, I am asking you, right? Really, this seems like this is inverted into that. This is transformed into this sort of masking. Because right here, we got to understand that right here, this is the side of not only castration, but also of primal repression, right? It's easier to stay at this level because this is sort of symbolic imaginary area, right? This is also the side of the ego ideal on this portion, right? But right here is also the level of enunciation that happens. And this is still the unconscious, don't get me wrong, right? The imaginary is not fully just consciousness. This is also unconscious going on, enunciation. But it's right here at this level that we get at the inconsistency, the barredness, and the level of demand, right? That is being regurgitated. So hopefully that long-winded circular spiel helps, and I wasn't butchering it, because this is the graph of desire is very complex, and I think it deserves its own study and video for that. Every statement is distinguished by the fact that the phrase "I am saying that" is subtracted from it. The form in which the I, which is the I of grammar, is thus is limited, is thus spared all essential risk and subtracted from enunciation, thereby reducing enunciation to the enunciated. So the enunciation is reduced. And on the contrary, I am saying that is not subtracted from the formula for demand, right? And this leaves intact the fact that any enunciation whatsoever turns into a demand, owing solely to the other structure. Other structures of ours, they're inconsistent. The question is twofold at this level. It asks the other what he is missing. I wonder what you desire. And two, it's double, which is the exact question I am pointing out today. Namely, I am asking you, not what I am, but rather, and this goes much further, what I is, right? What is the I, pretty much what I right? Is the very not that I have formulated, the proffer that man's desire is the other's desire. Because the I has nothing to do with me. Like, even though I use I as a sort of linguistic symbol to talk about me, the I ultimately represents the singularity that would be the other, right? But we realize that the other is not all, or should I say, the other is not whole, right? I am not all. So these two things, right? They ask the other what he's missing. I wonder what you desire. It's double, which is I am pointing out today. I am asking you not what I am, but rather what I is. The very not that I formulated by proffering that man's desire is the other's desire is instated at the level of little d and big A, the other's desire, or the desire for the other's desire. If you take the two vectors defined by the graph, the one that begins from the other and the one that the pure signifying chain that returns back to the intersection designated by BART SD in order to complete the retroactive movement, they converge at D and A. It as the two elements that I articulated converge there. I wonder what you desire. In other words, what you are lacking, which is linked to the fact that I am subjugated by you. I am subordinated to you, or I submit to you. A question that is connected to the very level at which big A is established. And two, I am asking you what I is, a question regarding the status of I as such, which is located here where I'm indicating it with red chalk. Unfortunately, the text doesn't have the red chalk. The convergence that constitutes the A is produced by an actual enunciation. If enunciating whatever comes to mind, which the fundamental rule of psychoanalysis posits as principle, turns into demand, it is because it is, by its very function of an enunciating, being a demand or a question concerning thou and the I. Symmetrically, the demand or question raised by the lack that is at the heart of the other's field, insofar as it is structured by a pure logic, converge on thou. This is what gives value and import to what we find, and which is just as vectorized on the other side of the graph. The subject's division is probably rendered inessential here, and this is what is instituted as I. Structure itself answers the question, who is I? With a refusal, an S barred A, signifier of the barred other, as I inscribed it in the function of the graph. Similarly, thou is instituted on the basis of a convergence between a request, a question, or a question, and a promise. I am referring to the most radical request, the one that is made to us. As analysts, the one that in the end sustains the subject's discourse. Namely, at the first stage, I am coming here to ask you who I am, which we respond to the level of who is I, irrespective supplied here by logical necessity. And I'm referring to the promise, the hope to assemble this quote I at S2, I being at the source of this articulating chain of knowledge. That's me speaking, by the way, which I designated in the transference with the term subject supposed to know. So this I becomes knowledge as a subject supposed to know, because subject supposed to know is the effect of the transference. And the subject supposed to know is pretty much what the analyst sort of occupies, right? The subject supposed to know. It is the knot of the first conjunction of S1 linked to S2 that grounds knowledge in the ordered pair. I is palpable only between two diverging poles, S and barred A, which I articulated here as the no or refusal that gives form to the lack of response, and the little s and a, the others signified, right? Or what is signified to the other. But what is this signification? It isn't clear, for it isn't it clear that the whole discourse that I am spinning in order to provide a framework for the I of the question on which psychoanalytic practice is based. Isn't it clear that I'm spinning it while leaving no signification outside, thus far at least? What does this mean? If not that after having for many years trained you to ground our work in the linguistic distinction between the signifier as material and the signified as its effect, you may suspect that some mirage lies outside lies at the core of the field defined as linguistic. If only when we see the astonishing passion with which linguists articulate that what they are trying to grasp in language is pure form, not content. I'm going to return here to a point that I am not unintentionally presented to you. I not unintentionally presented to you in my first lecture. One regarding pots. If I provided a digression, there's on a mustard pot. It was no accident. Those of you who take notes should realize that none of what one might call my digressions upon first broaching a field are lacking in premeditation. You may remember that I mentioned something that is truly worth pointing out in first form of the appearance of pots, which is that their surface never fails to have signifying marks on them. Isn't the I somehow formulated here or there? If the potter's activity is the best image of human creation, it is because the properties of the utensils it produces gives us the precise sense that language, the language with which it is made, for where there is no language, there is no work either, is a content. And so this kind of goes to the heart of something that was, illuminated to me by Molinaro when he talks about object minimalism of the linguistics, right? And so far as that Lacan will then definitely take that part on, but also with his rendition of this, the algorithm of the signifier and signified, signified as effect, as he just said, right? And the signifier, which refers to another signifier for its meaning, the properties of the signifier are thus created from the work and articulation that is done in the signifying chain, right? There is no property to the signifier prior to that. From the combination of different signifiers in this nihilating and differentiating field, something is produced not only as meaning and signification, as effect, which I think are on the level of the signified, which again is an effect. There is a materiality to the signifier, but there is an effect to the signified. But these couldn't be manifested without the combination and the logical necessity of the signifier that functions out on here. And this whole thing about the mustard pot is like, through the potter's creation, properties and the images are thus the effect of that, right? Or the effect of this pot. And the signifier, through structuring itself, manifests its properties from that, right? And it's not like, I wouldn't, it's not necessarily like some ex nihilo type thing. It's more that, you know, through the scientific theory of structural linguistics, looking at pure form, right, and object and property minimalism, at least for Lacan's side, we see how this manifests. We see how this operates. So if the potter's activity is the best image of human creation, is because the properties of the utensils it produces gives us the very precise sense that language, the language with which it is made, for where there is no language, there is no worker either, is a content. It is obvious if we think about it for a moment that the pot making is the very thing that suggests the traditional philosophical opposition between content and form. It was no accident that I pointed out, where I first discussed pots, that it places where they are destined to accompany the dead in their tombs. People do something more. They make holes in them. Indeed, the spiritual core of pots, their linguistic origin, is that there be a hole in them through which everything leaks out. When they are united with those who have passed over to the other side, pots also find a new, their true origin, namely the whole that they were designed to mask in language. There is no signification that does not leak with respect to what is contained in the bowl. It is truly odd that I made the following discovery after having talked to you about the function of pots. Looking up the status of the word where good Lord I usually look, namely in Bloch and von Wartburg's dictionary, I was surprised to see that the term in pre-Celtic, as it is witnessed, it seems, by Low German and Dutch, with which we share the term. Thus, it comes to us from long ago, from no less than the Neolithic. But there is something even better. To get a handle on the idea, we rely on the pots dating back to before the Roman invasion, or more precisely presenting what was instituted prior to it, that were dug up in the area around the Treves, also known in English as Trier. We find the written word potus on them, which according to Bloch and von Wartburg amounts to what is known as hypochoristic, using the name of the maker. They believe this suffices to indicate how old these pots are. To me, the only thing that is important is that when pots appear, they are always marked on the surface by a signifier for which they serve as props. Pots provide a function here that is distinct from that of the subject, because the subject in his relationship to the signifier is not a prerequisite, but rather an anticipation. The subject is presupposed. It is the hypokeimenon, is the underlying. That is the essence, his logical definition. He is presupposed, almost induced, even certainly induced. He is not a prop. we are, on the contrary, justified in giving the signifier a manufactured and even a utensil-based prop. The precise origin of utensils, insofar as it delineates the field of specifically human manufacturing, lies there. Signification, as produced, serves as a lure to veil from us the status of the essence of language, insofar as, by its very essence, it signifies nothing, right? What what proves this is that in its essential function, speaking is not a signifying operation. This is clearly how we analysts view it. And I guess this is why we need to focus on discourse without speech, right? What we are seeking is that which holds what is articulated about the other in abeyance and lies outside of the other as such, S2 as outside of the field. What is its subject? That is the question. So I guess that is something that, before I continue the last thing, this is something that I think maybe, I'm mixing up. It's that it's this problem of knowledge that lies outside the other, right? And I think maybe it's not wrong to say that, there is signifying articulation. The battery bank of signifiers is the big A, but knowledge as such lies outside the other. And I think this is because of the inconsistency and gap structured around the other, right? What is its subject? That is the question. And if the subject cannot in any way be grasped by discourse, what is the proper articulation of what can be substituted for it? The meaning of castration is counterbalanced by that of jouissance, but it is not enough to perceive this relationship. And what became clear at the time, that is not a very distant. People simultaneously cried out for truth and jouissance. He's talking about May 68, right? The protests, the riots, right? All the student leftists and the workers. But it certainly does not suffice to aspire to jouissance without constraints. When it is clear that for everything being included in language and utensils, jouissance can only be articulated in the register inherent to both of them. The register of the remainder, the leftover, the scrap, that I define as plus de jouir. We will pick it up there on January 8th. So when we were talking about the articulation of jouissance via knowledge, it is only through the remainder. It is only through the scrap. And I think this is what entails the leftover, right? And because knowledge and jouissance are not necessarily the same thing, but jouissance is sort of the other side, it's the product that operates off the S2. It's that scrap remainder. I think this is what's tying in this everything together as far as like this problem of the other and the inconsistency, this question of not only what is it that you desire, but what is the I? Who am I? Right? And this thing that's trying to be articulated through language, but it's this constant repetition of asking or demanding that, and something left out of that equation is related to this scrap. So thank you for tuning in. And maybe I should have said this before, but if you've made it this far and are now listening, this is not a podcast. This is a learning endeavor. And so if you are sitting right here with your seminar, then kudos to you, right? Because one of the main things that's hard about learning online outside of the university is to try to not cave in and give way to the demands of the algorithm of being an influencer and giving horseshit half-assed knowledge, right? Not even knowledge, just specular images, just sort of interpassive spectacles of just, hey, look, I've read this and this such text, but you really haven't. What I did right here, even in my errors and even in messing up, was doing a legit exegesis and investigation. While, doing the best of my ability to demonstrate the amount of familiarity and the work that I've put in with this seminar and of Lacan in general, and hoping that and inviting you to embark upon this journey with me, not so that you will be a big Signorelliite or Signorelliism, but so that you may also become an organic intellectual on your own and tarry with the negative, tarry with your symptom, right? Enter the parallax view, be a parallax viewer. Thank you all. I hope you enjoy that and enjoy the rest of your evening, day, or morning, or whatever time you are located in. Peace.